here this afternoon on a Sunday. History in any country is a form of capital. It's a resource that governments, political movements, academics, all want to monopolize. And I think that's especially true here in India, our relatively new nation, which has been the only created out of the only major civilization where all four great world religions have at different times ruled and collided. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, the competition amongst believers to control history struck me constantly as I traveled across India working on my book. And perhaps nowhere more concretely so than in a sleepy village in central India. In that village, Sanati, there's a tiny temple which is dedicated to the goddess Kalikamba. And some years ago, a huge storm smashed the roof over her head. When workers cleared the rubble, they flipped over the altar stone on which the deity stood. Its center had been smashed out to hold the square pedestal on which the goddess stood. On the underside of that altar stone were inscriptions in the ancient Brahmi script. Two rock edicts, it turned out, of the 3rd century emperor Ashoka, the famous follower of the Buddha who had ruled over much of India. In later centuries, Brahmin priests had literally overturned that earlier history, repurposing Ashoka's stone as a base for their own deity. And Ashoka's message on these particular edicts? Well, it was an eloquent call for respecting those whose beliefs were different from your own. Now, even if Ashoka might not have appreciated the irony, I think at least we can. The founders of independent India promoted a romantic sense of the Indian past. Gandhi preached about India's innate tolerance, its accommodation of differences. Nehru famously described Indian history as a palimpsest, where each successively dominant culture, religion, or group left its traces, never quite effacing what came before. Now, that's a beautiful image. It's politically instrumental, and I think it is in some ways evocative of the country's deep civilizational stratigraphy. Yet, in fact, what history of what country, of any country, is as passive as that? So my book tries to bring to life the reality that's represented by that overturned Ashokan stone at Sanati. That's to say, the past is an arena of furious contest, a space of suppressions, subversions, and of often historical guerrilla actions. A place where dead heroes regularly spring back to life, dispatched to the front lines of contemporary cultural and political battles. It's long frustrated me how the richness of Indian history gets flattened by and subordinated to ideology. It happened under British colonial rule, as well as during our own nationalist movement. And it's still happening once again, I think, in contemporary, supposedly more sophisticated 21st century India. Myth and legend replace context. Complex individuals are incarnated as cartoons, and the pursuit of historical understanding becomes an intellectual civil war, one in which scholars and institutions have been casualties of religious censor, often, though not only, from right-wing Hindu groups. And I think one cost to the general public, inside and outside of India, is that it's harder and harder to really grasp how contemporary India, one of the world's truly, I think, inventive democratic experiments, in addition to being an emerging economic dynamo, it gets harder to grasp how it's come to be. And so I decided to face this particular political moment in India in a way that went beyond mere complaint about the often pernicious trends and the sometimes ludicrous legends that we tell about our historical figures. Rather, could I find a way to challenge those legends and other historiographic conventions by telling the story of the Indian past through the fascinating individuals whose ideas and choices made that history. That was really the question that I posed for myself in this project. And I wanted to write about those individuals with nuance and rigor in scholarship, but also to do it in a literary form that was engaging and I hope inviting, and that took you into the story. For I think the Indian collisions between beliefs and traditions have helped to create actually new social, philosophical, and practical forms, innovations and innovators that I think are far too important to be buried in scholasticism. Rather, I think if we get to know these individuals as they were, we can actually see how much they have to contribute to some of the urgent, entrenched problems of India today, but indeed of the world at large. And I think we can also see that in their rich, cantankerous diversity, the life stories of the individuals I write about provide us with an incredible array of experiments in thinking and in living. And if we choose to recognize this array of experiments, I think they can afford us a really valuable resource in advancing the quite remarkable historical project on which we were launched by our founders in the middle of the 20th century. That's to say, the project of building an open, free, and fair society, and doing so by democratic means. So it was with these sorts of thoughts in mind that I began my long, winding, and evidence-seeking journey through Indian cities and villages over the last 3 years. A journey that became, in the first instance, a 50-part BBC radio and podcast series, and that culminated in my book, Incarnations. In that book, starting with the Buddha, I trace some 2,500 years of Indian history through 50 remarkable lives. Scientists, philosophers, kings, artists, poets, photographers, freedom fighters, industrialists, musicians, mathematicians, a second-century healer whose lessons on Ayurveda are still used to treat conditions from infertility to diabetes around the world today. The baby-faced monk Vivekananda, who effectively founded yoga while in Manhattan in the 1890s, as it happens. And the result, I think, is a story of the Indian past that is neither just an account of diverse fragments, nor a smooth, singular narrative, but I think still offers a connected account, a more connected account of the past than we currently have. Some of the names you'll find in my book are well known, but I think remain in many ways misunderstood, including Vivekananda, who was in many ways a perceptive critic of many aspects of Hinduism, who was deeply influenced by his encounters with egalitarianism in America, and yet has been turned into quite a simplified mascot of the Hindu right today. Other extraordinary figures you'll meet, like, for instance, Chidambaram Pillai. Sorry, some of these slides are quite heavy. Like Chidambaram Pillai, who was a sort of doughty South Indian freedom fighter who decided to take on the British Empire's shipping might. And people like him, I think their story is barely known at all, or at least barely known outside his Tamil homeland. And to complicate and contextualize each of the 50 stories, I explored important new scholarship. So archaeological discoveries, advances in our understanding of Sanskrit science and art history, newly recovered documents. That is a page from the mathematician Srinivas Ramanujan's so-called lost notebook that I was lucky enough to be able to consult in the Trinity College Library in Cambridge. Documents like that, and also declassified files. And I drew upon all these sources, not just to bring precision to historical biography, but in order to puncture some of the conventional understandings that are held about India, ones that reign not just in the minds of Westerners, but sometimes in our own minds too. In short, India's today is simply too important to be so superficially understood. So I decided to try to demythologize Indian history a little in order to rehumanize it again. And in doing that, and I want to underline a related intention of mine in this project, which I think seems relevant particularly to the struggles unfolding around us today. Through the essays in my book, I'd like to remind readers that what's driven India forward, made it stronger and less oppressive historically, has often been the spirit of individual dissent. The rabble-rousers and the critics that I write about, and yes, they were often young men and women, and they were often indeed angry young men and women, took on their society and its customs and habits in brave and quite imaginative, sometimes spectacularly imaginative ways, and often under very constrained circumstances. And in so doing, they contributed more than we sometimes like to acknowledge to India's contemporary incarnation as an emerging global power, or indeed as a global power. And so another bedrock premise of mine in this project is this, that I wanted to remind us that at times, and especially at times like these, studying the arc of Indian history isn't just a backward-looking indulgence. It isn't just a scholastic luxury. Rather, it's an active means of pushing us forward towards something that may be greater than we are today. A deeper grasp of our own history can help us, for instance, to see more clearly than we do the absurdity of some quite persistent stereotypes, as I say, that are held both in the West but also here at home. Take the belief that India has only recently woken up to globalization. Well, begging to differ would, of course, be the Parsi entrepreneur Jamsetji Tata. He rode the roller coaster markets of the 19th century, skewed as they were in favor of colonial interests, to build the corporate empire that now owns everything from Land Rover to Tetley Tea. And as I show in my book, he also came to embody something that's quite scarce in contemporary Indian tycoon life. And that's to say, a sense of deep responsibility to the workers and the society in which he prospered, and an ability to combine private interest with public purpose. And contrast that with another shrewd entrepreneur and empire builder in my book, Dhirubhai Ambani, whose story I also tell, an amazing story of a young man who worked his way up from a Gujarati village by being, as he himself said, and these are his own words, the bigger shark. And I show how he built his fortune and the fortune of his sons by considering inequality not as a social problem, but rather as a brilliant corporate stratagem. Well, here's another stereotype of India, that it's a land of mystical traditions, remote from steely analytical thought. And indeed, in my book, I do explore the lives of a number of spiritual philosophers and thinkers, people like Adi Shankara or Amir Khusru or Guru Nanak. But I also wanted to remind us of other intellectual lineages that we have in our history. And so in Mysore, I got to hold in my hands a text from before the Common Era that complicates the view of India as a place of unearthly spiritualism. Inscribed on the palm leaves, the manuscript was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century. And it established that Indian thinking had, in the person of Kautilya, the author of this manuscript, a political mind that made Machiavelli, who lived some 1,500 years after him, that made Machiavelli look gentle as a lamb. 2 millennia ago, Kautilya was counseling kings in the treacherous arts of what today we would call disinformation, surveillance, and covert ops. And here's just one sentence to give you an example in this unnervingly ruthless strategic work. And Kautilya writes, an arrow unleashed by an archer may kill a single man or not kill anyone, but a strategy unleashed by a wise man kills even those still in the womb. So there's nothing mystical or spiritual about Kautilya. Rather, he advocates guile, cunning, and deceit is essential to maintaining power. And indeed, today, his advice, his cutthroat advice, has become a guide to corporate success in a competitive economy. You'll find these sorts of manuals all over the pavements and street stoplight sellers in this city. And I'm told that the Pakistani army even prescribes Kautilya to their trainee officers as a way to gain insight into the devious Indian mind. But not many outside of India have heard of Kautilya. And actually, even here, few really study him. And so a significant strain of Indian political philosophy, not to mention a very good read, is exiled from its rightful position of being an international classic of political thought, and also one that reminds us that the contemporary balancing act in our country today between liberty, security, and prosperity has actually been the subject of reflection for many centuries in India. So, as I made my series of radio programs and podcasts with the BBC, I thought of them as a kind of gateway drug, meant to lead you to the deeper, more immersive experience of the book, and I hope in the end the more stimulating experience of the book. And in the book itself, my hope is that each individual essay, although you don't have to read them in sequence, but I hope that each individual essay serves as a gateway to the next essay, so that by the end you get a nuanced sense of the arc and texture of Indian history. That need for nuance, I think, extends even to the individuals we celebrate most of all. Take, for instance, that most famous Indian reformer of modern times, Gandhi. Gandhi is often portrayed as a spiritual paragon, someone who transcends his historical moment. But in the story that I tell about his rise to power, I try to tell it with a little bit more nuance. I hope to get you to see him with a bit more nuance, as an individual whose flaws and eccentricities were matched by some very modern strategic gifts. For one, he was a brilliant maker and exploiter of mass media images, someone who could have taught people in today's corporate world a thing or two about branding. Take, for instance, his most famous act of nonviolent resistance. You all know, of course, it was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930, that 200-mile protest march from his ashram to the sea. Its goal was to pick up a handful of salt and to defy the British. Now, Gandhi always liked to say that this decision to undertake this march, the decision to make salt the symbol of his contest against the British, that it came to him in a flash of inspiration. It was his inner voice who told him he should do this. But in fact, if you look at the historical record, he planned and managed the march's execution with uncanny grasp of the media as a political tool. So, for instance, the 79 marchers who accompanied him, well, each one was chosen and vetted by Gandhi himself. No political colleagues were invited, lest they distract attention that he wanted centered on himself. The marchers' outfits, well, Gandhi designed every one of them. No political insignia were allowed, no symbols, no emblems, nothing like that, because he wanted the procession and the marches to convey a timeless, universal quality. And he alone was allowed to carry a stick, because he wanted to ensure that his own leadership would stand out amongst the marchers. And as a finishing touch, he dispatched in advance of the march his group of followers to whip up the excitement of villagers that he was about to enter. Of course, which he entered, followed by motor brigades of camera crews. And those camera crews that came from around the world, well, needless to say, Gandhi had invited them, chosen them, and invited them to accompany him on the march. And so the jiggly footage of the Mahatma striding across the dusty plains, leading his band of followers, became imprinted on the imaginations of people all across the world the tiny stick man with teapot ears showing up the imperial blimps. Some months after the march, Time magazine would draw him for their cover. And it's a cover in which he's shown studying a newspaper, reading perhaps of his own success at managing the media around the world. Now, to see Gandhi as the strategist he was isn't, of course, to diminish him. It's rather, I think, to bring to life a leader who ranks beside a very small handful of contemporaries who remade the modern world. But unlike, of course, a Stalin or a Hitler or a Mao, Gandhi won power through nonviolence, and his goals were infinitely different, and they required, as I tell in my essay, real grit and nerve to achieve. Now, Gandhi was hardly necessarily the most progressive of our imaginative dissenters. Consider, for instance, the example of Ramaswamy Nekar, or as he was more commonly known, Periyar, a regional hero of the South, who I think should really be an all-India one. With his wild beard, he reminds me of a beat poet, down to the little dog that he kept beside him, which he always said he kept there in order to scare off Brahmins. He was also an atheist and a rationalist, which can get you in deep trouble in India today. And for about 50 years, from the 1920s to the 1970s, he waged a campaign against what he saw as upper caste northerners dominating the national movement. He set himself up as a kind of anti-Gandhi. So in contrast to Gandhi's habit of dressing in white, Periyar always wore black. And one of the things that I find interesting is that he pressed for equality and greater freedom for women in many of his campaigns and speeches. So for almost half a century, he advocated women's rights and, for instance, unhindered access to contraception, often in very blunt and fighting prose in his newspapers and in his speeches. And just to give you an example of his language, here's something he wrote. Have cats ever freed rats? Have foxes ever liberated goats or chickens? Have whites ever enriched Indians? Have Brahmins ever given non-Brahmins justice? We can be confident that women will never be emancipated by men. Women, he would say again and again, had to free themselves through their own personal and political action. And as I traced the career of this very sharp-tongued reformer, as well as the careers of many other social disruptors in our history, I was reminded of how often, sometimes the kind of despair we feel about change happening actually isn't supported by the historical record. Because you can see that under sustained and creative criticism, even some of the most rigid orthodoxies in societies can start to change. And I think one instance of that is that in general, the position of women in southern India, for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons being Periyar's long campaign, is much better than it is in many other parts of the country. Another premise of mine in the book is that I think for too long, some of India's best minds and thinkers from the past have been forced to exist in a kind of splendid, simplified isolation, whether it's ancient figures like Panini or Ashoka, or someone like, for instance, Ram Mohan Roy. He was a man who, in the late 18th century, and early 19th century, corresponded with Tom Paine. He conversed with Jeremy Bentham. He celebrated the inauguration of the Brazilian Constitution in Calcutta. And Roy, in his campaigns against Sati, was part of, in a sense, the first global humanitarian movements in the early 19th century, which included the abolition of slavery, the rights of women, and of oppressed nations. And I think we need to see our figures in that wider context. Now, the fact that in his own private life he didn't always live up to his ideals, I think is also important not to airbrush out of the situation. So the book tries to restore such figures to their rightful place, as men and women engage with other individuals across time and across borders. But my approach is also critical of stereotypes that we ourselves trade in here in India. And many of those, of course, relate to women given the deep roots of patriarchy here, but also that there are many, many fewer records, historical records, for significant females than there are for their male counterparts, particularly if you go back beyond 100 or 150 years. And I think the absence of those records plays into this tendency to turn real women of intellectual fallibility and of bravery into goddess-type figures, figures that can be worshipped by women today, but not emulated. And consider as an example the story of Lakshmibai, the Rani or Queen of Jhansi, who, as you all know, resisted the British during the uprising of 1857. This Jezebel Rani, as the British termed Lakshmibai, would be commemorated in Western adventure and romance novels all through the Victorian period as a kind of tempestuous villainess. Meanwhile, most of us here know of her as this heroine frozen in a single dramatic image, astride a leaping horse, sword raised high, her adopted son clinging to her back. That's a version of the image made from recycled tin just below her fort in Jhansi. And the British are about to conquer her fort, but instead of surrendering, she's making a bold midnight escape over the ramparts. But as I looked down from the fort walls where she supposedly leapt, only one word came to my mind, and that was splat. And yet she's been stuck in this kind of militant goddess version, flying goddess version of history, like those Western Jezebel tales, which leave little room for the actual earthbound queen that she was, a woman who was struggling to maintain her rule over a kingdom that the British wanted. So it was a relief to find a contemporary source, a contemporary record, which gives us a much more personal insight into her. It turns out that she believed in a good workout. Weightlifting, wrestling, and steeplechase were just part of her pre-breakfast routine. She couldn't care less about regal trappings, in contrast to her cross-dressing husband. And she was such a hands-on ruler that she punished criminals herself, often with the whack of a stick. But under pressure from the British, she was forced into a series of decisions, decided to support the rebels from the north, and of course, that ended up with tragic results. But as I tell the story, one of my goals is to restore to the past, the Indian past, something that it's very short on, which is sophisticated judgment-making women leaders, female leaders, as real individuals grappling with difficult conditions that today's young people might actually engage with. Or another stereotype that we have here that traps our imagination here concerns the race. And that's a subject that I explore in an essay about a remarkable Ethiopian teenager who was shipped to India as a slave and who rose to become a power broker in the Deccan Plains. Malik Ambar, some of you may have heard his name, but to many of us, he's not that familiar. He gets excluded from the pantheon because he doesn't fall into any of the standard narrative silos of Indian history, Hindu, Muslim, European, etc. And traveling across for my book, I heard many young Indians talk about the bravery of Shivaji, the 17th century Hindu warrior who we all know about in this city. But when I mentioned Malik Ambar, who actually beat back Mughal expansion before Shivaji, eyes went blank. And I think that's a real shame, because Malik Ambar's story is a remarkable story of genuine and improbable self-making. He was shipped from Africa as human chattel in exchange for Indian cloth, part of a thriving but now little remembered slave trade that traveled eastwards from Africa to India, as against the more conventional view we have of the slave trade west from Africa to the Americas. He was an indentured warrior, and he was forced to fight for Deccan rulers. But he also managed to acquire a whole range of other non-martial skills, languages, a knowledge of engineering works, and accounting. And before long, he was recognized by his master, not just as a great fighter, but as a fine strategic mind. Freed ultimately by his master, Malik Ambar quickly acquired a power of his own. And through guerrilla tactics and nighttime raids in the treacherous hilly Deccan landscape, he fought back the Mughal Emperor Akbar and his son Jahangir, and ultimately gained control over much of the Deccan. Indeed, he became such a nemesis of the Mughals that the Emperor Jahangir took to commissioning gruesome miniature paintings like this one, in which Jahangir is portrayed shooting an arrow at the beheaded Ethiopian. It's a complete fantasy because Jahangir never actually managed to capture Malik Ambar. And yet, Malik Ambar has been written out of the historical record, and I think that's because he wasn't a native, he wasn't a Hindu native defending some ancient motherland. He was an African outsider, and in that way was marginalized from the historical record. And I think that's a great shame, both for our own understanding of our history, but also because there are descendants of his community who live in parts of India today, and children in those communities have given no chance to know about this remarkable figure whose skin color and lineage they actually share. So occasionally in slum lanes or village lanes, as I researched Incarnations, I overheard young kids, teenagers, explaining to their friends what they thought I was up to. And it went along the lines of, he's telling the story of how India became #1. And indeed, it's a habit, I think, of national histories to justify the present as the perfect and necessary outcome of what came before. But as I worked on this book, I was struck again and again by how many of the 50 individuals that I write about, like Malik Ambar, posed really sharp challenges to the Indian present. Through religious collisions, philosophical encounters, and moral experiments, these individuals were part of arguments that have been kept going in India for millennia about what kind of life is worth living, what kind of society is worth having, what hierarchies are morally legitimate, what role religion has in the political and legal order, what kind of love is valid, who owns the land and water, and what kind of place India should be. A civilization that can produce a Buddha and a Mirabai, a Phule, a Gandhi, and a Dhirubhai Ambani, that civilization is open, I think, both to radical experiments with self-definition and to productive arguments about what a country and its people should value. And I think such diverse energy is worth celebrating, especially at a time when nationalists and others in India today want to transform this multiplicity of ideas, this creative self-criticism and dissidence into a more singular ideological brew. I think this is a moment for a much deeper engagement with the Indian past and its legacies. As India becomes more and more central to discussions around the world, I see my book as a way of asking readers like yourselves to set aside the myths and to look afresh at our extraordinary history, which promises, I think, to complicate the stories that we Indians tell about ourselves, but also the stories that the world tells about us. And that's really my final point, that I'm arguing for a version of history that creates options for the future instead of foreclosing them. A human history that expands the world's store of available ideas and ideals. After all, it's not just we in India who have a stake in a country where 1/5 of the world resides. Because I think keeping India's future open enriches and enlarges the world more generally. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions now. Yes. Is there a microphone? No. Oh. What about this one here?
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening talk. Can't thank you enough. My name is Somnath. I wanted to ask you the question that, and you have written a book on the idea of India as well. If you were a citizen of India, staying in India at this point of time, an ordinary citizen, what do we need to do differently to strengthen this idea of India? Because, as you rightly said, there are a lot of, I would say, tailwinds and headwinds which are out there, forces of nationalism, polarization which is happening in the society. But we as citizens, what can we do differently?
Well, I think that's a very big question. There are so many things. I think one set of things we can do is inform ourselves better about both the historical and the contemporary record. I think one of the things that, it's a theme that's come up in many of the sessions today and over the last 3 days, is how people are playing much faster and looser with facts and with the truth, as it were. And I think one duty, one responsibility, in a sense, we all have as citizens is actually to inform ourselves about more accurately the facts about the past or about the present, whether it's through the study of history, whether it's the use of the Right to Information Act, or whether it's really trying to get down, because I think that's an essential weapon at moments like this, what the actual truth is. We talk a lot today, we hear a lot about the war on corruption, and of course we think about financial and economic corruption. But one of the greatest threats to a society is, I think, the corruption of truth. And when that goes, in a sense, you've lost really the battle. And the people who actually suffer most are the people without power, because the truth matters above all to those who don't have power. So whether it's poor citizens or any citizen taking on the government, it's only when you have the data, the facts, the information to counter an argument which is incorrect or untrue, that you can hope to change opinion. Because in the end, we are in a society where I think, and I believe, that we can persuade one another on the basis of, I hope, facts and information to change our opinion. So I think one thing we can do is take that much more seriously and get involved in the arguments, make sure that our kids are actually engaging with getting more knowledge about the past and the present, and not simply accepting the myths, the ideological stories, the legends, etc., that are often a substitute for the facts. So that's, in the context of what I'm talking about this evening, that's what I would say. But of course, there are many, many other things that one could do as well in a broader context. I think, yes, you had a question. Yes, next. Oh, but then I need a microphone.
Good evening, sir. We're looking forward to reading this great book. I just wanted to know that what is there which is all over the world. These authoritarian forces, not forces, persons or negative persons are gaining the ground.
Well, I think, again, a little bit of historical perspective is in order. But, actually, I'm just going to stand over there. I think it's easier. We have to remember that, after all, freedom was won in this country under some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable, under a much more authoritarian government than we've ever seen since 1947 in this country. There are many ways in which one can organize and defend and expand the realm of individual freedoms. And I think one should, that's again a way of looking at our history and seeing that at different moments, often under very constrained circumstances, whether it's to do with the social order or political authoritarianism or whatever it might be, that people have taken on power and managed to change the rules and expand the realm of freedom. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind, that often at moments that look very dark, even think more recently of, let's say, the period of the emergency. where when we were in the midst of that, it looked, like it was the end of democracy, and yet things changed. So I think one needs to keep that perspective, that often when you're in the midst of it, it looks like it's all going downhill, or it's all under threat. But that's exactly when you have to push back and engage and make the arguments that you believe in. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Khilnani, for brilliantly encapsulating the 50 incarnations in 50 minutes, which was fascinating. My question to you is, in the current scenario, as a scholar who has actually studied and come up with your own fabulous alternative narratives to counter almost all the contemporary crises that you see from your own lens, what would these 5 personalities currently, and perhaps 5 processes, stroke events, institutions that you think need to be strengthened?
I'd love to hear your views on this. 5 processes, I mean, clearly, and this is going to sound like a not fantastically original checklist, but, clearly institutions are critical for a society such as ours, an open society. And, we've seen, in a sense, we're still living off the institutional capital of the first 2 decades of our independence, a time when many of the institutions were established, whose benefits we are still receiving. But there's been very little real institutional invention and innovation since then. Many institutions have been created, and so, you get endless, but actually imagining them in new ways, trying to make them function in new ways, that really hasn't happened. So I think that's one process that would be very, very important. I think another process is the engagement more broadly of the citizenry in the political realm beyond just elections. I mean, we're very proud of our high turnouts at elections, but of course democracy is not just about elections, it's about holding power accountable once you have elected power. And I think the third related to that would be the media and the press. Again, we've heard a lot in the last 3 days about the pressures that the press is under today. I mean, both from social media, but also from the corporate world and also the political world. And I think the strengthening of that is going to be really important. In terms of, personalities or people who I think they come from such a realm, a different array of realms today in India. I think that, there's some extraordinary activists who are very important to keeping the political space open. There are also entrepreneurs who are finding a way to make important social contributions, but in a way that's profitable, and I think that's also important. So people from those realms, I think, are doing a lot, but I don't think we can make from that the conclusion that's sometimes drawn, which is that, leave it to society, we'll sort it out. I think we do need the politicians, we do need the bureaucrats, we do need those who are in charge of the powers of the state also to play a much more productive role. And there, both the quality of people who go into those positions, I think that's something we should all think about. Why are the best people not going in? Why are we not encouraging that to happen? But also, how do we hold those who are in those realms more accountable for what they do? Those are the broad answer. Yes.
Good evening, sir. There's a good old saying. Democracy without education is hypocrisy without limitation.
So, can you say that again? The acoustics are bad.
Democracy without education is hypocrisy without limitation. We are the world's largest democracy, and we are a maturing democracy. But however, there is a certain section of population that is disgruntled because of they are being deprived of their land, they have been marginalized, and they don't believe in democracy, and they have taken up guns, like the Naxalites, I don't want to name the other militants and all that. So what needs to be done to restore their faith in democracy so that they drop the gun, have dialogue with the powers that be, and take to peaceful methods to, make the government their adversary and, establish themselves as a legitimate power rather than, taking up cudgels against the government?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a couple of things to say. First of all, people don't take to the gun or to violence out of any easy choice. It means that they've really been forced into a position where they feel quite desperate, or, as you say, no longer trusting in the institutions that are available to them, or they don't see any institutions around. So I think one thing that needs to happen there is to be able to actually make the institutions of the state and public office function in those areas. I mean, that would be a first step to allowing people to have some confidence in those institutions. So I think when people lose faith in democracy, there's usually a reason for it, and we need to address that from the point of view of what they're being asked to be part of. And if they feel they're being asked to be part of something that just doesn't exist or doesn't bring them any benefit or any change, then they're not going to be part of it. And I think that's what we're seeing. So in a sense, it's also a responsibility to the broader citizenry to give them an incentive to stay in the game. And you see this withdrawal of trust in democracy, but it's also there, you're seeing it in other parts of the world, a kind of withdrawal of trust also in capitalism. And that, these are very dangerous things when they happen, because we need those, we need commitment and trust in those things to actually be able to move ahead. But those things, trust doesn't grow naturally. It's a kind of complex web that exists between all of us and between the state and us. So again, I think it's important to see how we are responsible for some of these things, rather than blaming others for their lack of education or their blindness or whatever it is. Because in the end, it is a web in which everyone has a role and a responsibility to play, and I think we need to be more aware and recognizing of that. But I'm told that we're out of time, so thank you very much.